When I started the Fire Emblem Retrospective last year, there were two games I wasn't looking forward to playing again. The first one of those was Genealogy of the Holy War, and if you saw my episode on that game, then you'll understand exactly why. The second game I wasn't looking forward to playing is the one we're talking about now, that being Radiant Dawn. Path of Radiance amazed me when I first played it, but my opinions on Radiant Dawn couldn't have been any more opposite. Igarn Dodd hated this game when I played it. A story that was a constantly shifting mess, some oddly boring characters coming off of Path of Radiance, and a difficulty that my 18-year-old self wasn't ready for. So I returned to this game nearly 4 years after playing it last, coming fresh off of Path of Radiance, and having officially played through every Fire Emblem game so far. It's time to look back on this game once more with fresh eyes. Because of the development timing on Path of Radiance taking so long, Intelligent Systems wasn't working on any particular Fire Emblem projects by the time they got a development kit for the Nintendo Wii. Because of this, they could begin a new project for the upcoming console. Radiant Dawn was that game. It released in 2007 and was a sequel to Path of Radiance. The decision to return to Tellius was an obvious one. Path of Radiance was incomplete. Certain plot threads were left hanging, or just not as fleshed out as they could have been. Many characters were introduced feeling like they were supposed to be way more important to the story than they actually ended up being. They made a unique Hawk portrait for this one dude, gave him a name, only for him to get killed in the same scene. Let us write some eulogies for Lotz. He didn't die for this. And you know what? Someone agreed with me. Toru Narihiro, the big cheese of Fire Emblem at this point, expressed some disappointment with the final build for Path of Radiance. He felt that the game was only around 70% complete. But with sequel opportunity, they could expand upon this missing third of their previous work, and flesh it out into a full game. But rather than continuing on with the story of Ike, Team Emblem decided to start on a much different path. You truly have no idea how to rule a nation. Do you know what happens to a country that loses a war? Everything is destroyed. Homes, lands, crops, everything. And the citizens? They're not even treated as human. Path of Radiance, more than any game in the series at that time, painted a picture of just how consequential war would be. And knowing what's to come in Radiant Dawn, this quote from Soren is terrifyingly foresighted. 3 years have passed since the Mad King's War. Crimea, not having the resources to reconstruct more than its own nation, passes sovereignty to Benyan. With no king or representative of the people, the Benyan Occupation Army are the effective rulers of the country. And just rulers they are not. If the citizens don't listen to the orders of passing soldiers, or make themselves remotely suspicious, the Occupation Army has no problems killing people to get their point across. In response, a group of Dayan's young adults come together and form the Dawn Brigade, a vigilante group that does whatever they can to assist the people. Their leader is Micaiah, a woman with silver hair that not only has the ability to heal anyone she touches, but to also see into the future as well. With these unnatural abilities, she is known by the people as the Silver-Haired Maiden, and is the country's symbol of hope. Of course, Benyan can't have that, so they pursued the Dawn Brigade from very early on. Though the Dawn Brigade follows a righteous cause, it is ultimately an aimless one. With a group so small, there's only so much they can do. Until they hear rumors. Rumors of a lost son of the late King Ashnard, amassing an army to win back their homeland. Following the rumors, they turn to be true, and Prince Peleus asks Micaiah to be his general for the liberation. From here, Radiant Dawn's story is the typical affair we've seen from many games of the series. We, as a small army, must rally our troops and gather allies loyal to our cause to eventually take back the throne that was lost. While I would normally complain about a Shadow Dragon plot being in the series again, it isn't a problem in reality as long as they do interesting things with that setup. Despite Sacred Stones using a similar scenario, I forgave that aspect due to the great character dynamics between the heroes and the villains. Radiant Dawn makes this tale much more interesting by exploring the primary accounts of a country that lost a war. A story that I don't see too many games of its type explore. Micaiah hates Crimea, not only resenting them for destroying Dayan, but also leaving them to die in Benyan's hands. While her best friend Soth looks back on the days he served under General Ike fondly, Micaiah is disgusted whenever his name is mentioned. But as more battles are claimed in victory by the Dawn Brigade, the closer we get to restoring the country. And we, as the audience, get to learn the irony of this situation. Turns out the Benyan Senate are really the puppeteers behind the occupation army's actions. So in order to keep that secret from going discovered, they betray their soldiers, causing those that are left to go crazy and obliterate anything that comes in their sight. If the Dayan army moves to defeat the occupation, they could lose favor in the eyes of Benyan. But if they wait idly, then they will have automatically won the war, and will watch the lives of their people be taken in the process. Pelias and Micaiah know in their heart what they must do, even if it's probably the wrong political decision. So with the Dayan army resolve at its high point, they march onto Navassa in... Wait, endgame? 10 chapters in and this is it? Well, yes and no. Radiant Dawn was a very ambitious game for the Fire Emblem series. Micaiah, Soth, Elincia, Ike, none of these people are the central focus. The main character of Radiant Dawn is the Continent of Tellius itself. Part 2 follows Elincia. Now being crowned queen of her country, a lot rests on her shoulders, and not all of her people are satisfied. Because of rising tensions, civil war becomes a very real threat. But this is also the shortest part of the game, only lasting a few hours. The story of this section holds very little bearing over the rest of Radiant Dawn's plot. Really, it's just the game's way of reintroducing many characters we met in Path of Radiance, including the heroes we originally commanded. Part 3 follows primarily the Grail Mercenaries, while also sometimes switching back to the Dawn Brigade or the Crimean Royal Knights. But if I had to call any part of Radiant Dawn the main game, it would be Part 3. The act begins with the Grail Mercenaries being hired by Gallia to assist them in a war against Benyan. Turns out the assassination of the previous apostle wasn't caused by Dayan as originally believed, but rather it was the Benyan Senate. And to deflect blame from themselves, they used the Serenus Herons as their scapegoats. So when the rest of the Laguz nation learns the truth, they get pissed and declare war. The battle only gets more gruesome as time goes on. To put an end to the war as quickly as possible, Benyan summons Zelgius, one of their most prized generals and valuable soldiers. But due to an
interesting maneuver,
Benyan is in desperate need of allies. To counter the full opposition of the Laguz, Benyan then involves Dayan. They rope Crimea into the war as well, and even the supposedly neutral Goldoan dragons get involved when Dayan begs out of desperation. The whole continent of Tellius now has representatives of each nation with a stake in the war, leading to a dire situation we've been warned about since Path of Radiance. Part 4 is the final act of the game, the part where all your surviving heroes come together to fight a new common enemy. But I really don't want to say too much more out of worry that I'll spoil a little too much. Bear in mind that if I want to keep this video at least a reasonably short length, a gross summarization for each part is really the best I can do. There is a lot that happens in this game, but at least this game does a good job at always keeping the story moving. I would hesitate to say that Radiant Dawn has better pacing than its predecessor. For being about 50 chapters long while still being only a tiny bit longer, we can undeniably say that Radiant Dawn is much faster than Path of Radiance. However, slow pacing isn't necessarily bad pacing, and Radiant Dawn could have benefited from taking a few moments to breathe. Each part of Radiant Dawn could have been a full Fire Emblem game in its own right. I would have loved to play a Fire Emblem game that was just about the rise of Dayan, or Elincia's struggles as a ruler, or a fully developed narrative about the Continental War of Part 3. And yet the full potential of all three narratives is nixed by virtue of this game being a conglomerate story. But even beyond that, just more details sprinkled throughout could have made a huge impact in my overall enjoyment. Take Part 1, Chapter 2 for instance. The objective is to take medicine from a rich guy's supply. The chapter ends with Lorak proclaiming she'll find the medicine. The scene after is the Dawn Brigade then searching the forest to find Laura after she went missing. Sorry, is there a scene I accidentally skipped somewhere? This is a problem that Radiant Dawn's story consistently has. It has an almost schizophrenic tone that even a few lines of dialogue here and there could reasonably address. And to be completely fair, it's a problem that's not even Intelligent System's fault. This game actually did something really cool when it originally came out. The normal mode of this game featured a fairly basic script. It was meant for both younger audiences that didn't have a full grasp of the language, as well as people who would be satisfied knowing an overview of the plot. But the hard and maniac difficulties featured an extended script that really went into detail on the setting, relationships of characters, and giving scenes the proper time they deserved. When this game was officially localized, Nintendo actually decided to implement a new script with complete parity over all difficulty settings. While I respect the idea of rewarding more story to the people who play on harder difficulties, I'm way more down for getting the same story regardless of which difficulty I want to play on. But there's a problem. While they did take from the extended script in a few certain cases, the story cutscenes were based on the condensed normal mode script. I assume they took this route because translating the game twice would have probably been a nightmare, so why not just go for the easiest possible option? But looking back from 2019, we missed out on a ton of crucial plot details and defining character moments, and Radiant Dawn's story suffers for it. But I wish I could say that was the story's only problem. While Micaiah's ability to foresee the future sounds like an interesting power, it's ultimately just a plot device. You can't even use it in gameplay as a Milla's Turnwheel-esque system. Which, whatever, that's fine. But it would help me to forgive its implementation in the story. It's super overpowered in part 1, but when the Dawn Brigade needs to start losing the war for the narrative to progress, it all of a sudden doesn't work for no clear explanation. Even Dayan's involvement in the war is shaky at best, and absolutely infuriating at worst. Forcing Pelias under the will of the Benyan Senate is a blood pact, basically a contract which terms are the gradual destruction of the nation in question should the benefactors be inconvenienced. The villains in this game are so frustratingly evil that their actions legitimately make my blood boil. It feels like they go out of their way to twirl their mustaches in as many ways and places as possible. They were just plain deplorable, and very stupid. I'm of the opinion that moral gray in the Fire Emblem universe isn't as common as most people think, or at least its presence is just overpronounced. But it feels so absent in Radiant Dawn, especially since Path of Radiance did an excellent job of going through character confliction. Because of that, I wouldn't say that Radiant Dawn's story is extremely good, but I wouldn't say it's particularly bad either. At the very least, it left me satisfied. Being a part of Tellius as grander events unfolded, getting answers to mysteries that were built up over the course of 2 games, it felt like Radiant Dawn finally got to deliver on the ambition that Path of Radiance couldn't achieve. After finishing this game, I thought about the final moments for days. It made me feel like I was a part of an epic saga that Fire Emblem hadn't been able to do for me before or since. But as for gameplay elements, there isn't really a whole lot I have to say. Radiant Dawn in many ways is just a rebalanced, retooled version of Path of Radiance. While it did introduce a lot of things to the game, a lot of those were mostly quality of life and balance changes. The skill system works just as it had before. However, if you removed a skill off of a unit, you now received a skill scroll for it. You could trade around and reassign certain skills. Yes, that's right. Trade around, Paragon. Take those amazing skills off of the poo-poo units and give them to someone who could actually make use of them. Way back in Fire Emblem Gaiden, units started out as a base class, and they could eventually promote into a stronger class. However, what was unique about Gaiden is that they could promote into a 3rd tier on the promotion chain. Radiant Dawn is the only game in the series so far to bring 3rd tier units back. Units who promoted to this most powerful state were not only given more power, but insane skills that could destroy any opposition in their path. To be honest, it's not a super big deal. Most characters you get to play as in this game are returning from Path of Radiance, so because of that, almost all of them have received their promotions already. So this gives an avenue for players to still experience the joy of promoting units. There are still characters that start out as level 1 unpromoted units, but in my experience, it's difficult to get these characters to their 3rd tiers, even on easy mode. I mean, don't get me wrong, it would be incorrect to say that 3rd tiers felt tacked on, but it doesn't feel as rewarding as intelligent systems probably intended for them to be. This is also the first and only game in the series to make use of elevation. If a unit was positioned on a higher plane than their opponent, they would have a significant accuracy and avoidance buff, making archers and mages a key part to any army you controlled. Radiant Dawn also showed health bars for every unit on the map. This was very important. You could size up an enemy at any time, No more accidentally sending weakened units into battle after forgetting you needed to heal them. It was a great addition that made planning faster and easier. Though there was one change made that most fans of the series utterly despise. The support system for this game works almost the same as it always had. You actually had the ability to support any 2 characters you wanted, but there's a huge detriment. Firstly, you can only have one active relationship between 2 characters, and if you wanted to try another support build, you had to erase the link you already established. Secondly, and debatably the more egregious consequence of this shift, there were no support conversations between any pairs. The support conversations were some of my favorite parts of the Fire Emblem games in the past. Not having them in this game really took away my enjoyment of using characters I probably wouldn't have considered otherwise. But as a game during this generation, especially considering the console it released for, Radiant Dawn has aged very well from a gameplay standpoint. Intelligent Systems actually made a foresighted move by not implementing motion controls in any capacity. Because of that, you were offered a multitude of options when it came to playing the game. The default control scheme required you to hold the Wii Remote sideways, like you were playing an NES game on Virtual Console. But you could also hold the Wii Remote vertically, use a classic controller, or even a GameCube controller. But despite not using the central gimmick the Wii was sold on, Intelligent Systems still took great advantage of the new hardware they had. The overall presentation of Radiant Dawn is miles ahead of Path of Radiance. While not quite the quick and snappy animations of the Game Boy Advance games, the attention to detail adds so much to this game. Warm-up animations from both sides, characters having multiple ways of dodging, much more intensive skill and critical animations, victory poses upon winning a fight. All of these add so much to the game, and will keep your attention far longer than Path of Radiance. But that's also not mentioning the music. This was the first game in the series to use a fully orchestrated soundtrack. While I don't inherently hate MIDI compositions, there is something about hearing live instruments of a booming orchestra that is necessary to the Fire Emblem aesthetic for me. Quite a few songs return from Path of Radiance, and in almost every case, I vastly prefer the Radiant Dawn versions of the score. But neither of those were the coolest things about this game. If you played Path of Radiance all the way through, you could put your GameCube memory card into your Wii and transfer the saved data into Radiant Dawn. It wasn't too crazy. It would grant bonus stats to the units you used the most, but it was an amazing concept. But fortunately for me, these bonuses weren't really that necessary. Make no mistake, Radiant Dawn is a challenging game. One could say it's the most challenging game in any of the series released internationally. When I played this game for the first time, I struggled at almost every turn, but rarely is it ever a cheap challenge. The map design in Radiant Dawn is way better than I ever gave it credit for. For whatever reason, I remember these maps being overly sized, obnoxious, and tedious, but I really can't say that. In fact, most of the maps in this game, even in Part 3, take less time to complete than many maps from Path of Radiance. Maybe I just got some perspective after playing games like Genealogy and Thracia. Maybe I just got better at Fire Emblem since the last 4 years. Or maybe I wasn't using as hard as I should have been. But bottom line, these maps aren't frustrating. In fact, I'll come out and say it. Radiant Dawn probably has my favorite map design of the series so far. They really pushed the challenge aspect, even from its earliest hours. Radiant Dawn is demanding, and by the time Part 3 comes around, a lot more maps get multiple mission objectives. Some will dangle a carrot of short-term benefits that, if ignored, provide longer-term rewards. Directing ally units, an oddly underutilized mechanic from Path of Radiance, has much more presence in this game.
This game does an excellent job at keeping your tactical thinking and mindful prowess at the forefront. This is awesome. I loved playing on the maps in this game. There is just one problem that I do have with them, though. I just wish they were in a more balanced Fire Emblem game.
Radiant Dawn wanted to tell a really ambitious story about a continental war, but in doing so, it sacrificed sensible design decisions. While this game is the most difficult in the series among the international Fire Emblem releases, it's also the most inconsistently hard, especially if you're doing a blind playthrough. Unit availability is messed up in this game. This game seems to start out like many other Fire Emblem games do. In Part 1, you have a handful of heroes, and build upon that roster as you get further into the game, until you get some really powerful units. Did you know that this game lets you play as the Black Knight? Yeah, it's awesome! But he's a character with a maxed out level, so the intention is that you're only really supposed to use him if you absolutely need to, and that's fine. but he's also available in more chapters during Part 1 than Toru Nero, a significant character to the Dawn Brigade. Other than that, Part 1's really good about building your team as you progress. After Part 1 though, things get real whack, real fast. Radiant Dawn will give you units and take them away for what seems to be little rhyme or reason. For example, Part 2, the section of the game focusing on Valencia, is a character that is only playable in 2 chapters. In fact, Part 2 is effed up in general, almost completely cycling out your army which you used in the last chapter. When freaking Nelucci isn't available in more chapters than the main character of that part, you should probably rethink your unit availability. The Dawn Brigade aren't soldiers, they're basically kids only fighting out of necessity, so their chapters are naturally hard with them going up against huge odds. But switching to the rest of the playable cast is total whiplash. I didn't lose a single soldier in Part 2 at all, not even in the endgame. And the Grill mercenaries are so overpowered that the only reason they'll die is because of an unlucky crit from the enemy. And if you really wanted, you can recruit some of the best Dawn Brigade members to the Grill mercenaries and cuck Makai out of her best soldiers. Come on guys, give the Dawn Brigade a break! But let's compare this to Genealogy of the Holy War, a game also separated into multiple parts. But going from Part 1 to Part 2 is basically just a hard refresh on your team. Aside from a few cases, the game only ever added to your party. I think if Radiant Dawn made this consideration, it could have been much improved. If each section of the game had a roster of characters unique to that part, and balanced difficulty around them, I personally think this game would have been much better.
But I think it's time to start wrapping this episode up. If I had to describe my thoughts on Radiant Dawn, I would say that this game is weird, jarring, and disconnected, but in the end, it still did enough to leave me satisfied.
Radiant Dawn has a lot of problems, both with its narrative and the way it plays. It's not as fleshed out and polished as it probably should have been, but there's something charming about this game. If you play it when you're still relatively new to the series, I would understand why one would end up hating this game. Heck, I ended up hating this game at one point. But it's refreshing to come back much better and being able to appreciate the ambition that this one went for. In a way, this is the most Shozo Kaga-esque Fire Emblem game to come out in a post-Kaga era at Intelligent Systems. I can't believe I came out of this game with a completely changed perspective. From the time between 2015 and now, Radiant Dawn has officially gone from my least favorite game in the series to a consideration of the upper half of my personal rankings. I can now appreciate how much this game really wanted to feel distinct from the others in the series. But the ones that it does click with will definitely enjoy this game far more than I ever did.
But as for Fire Emblem, that was pretty much it. The DS would never get a Fire Emblem game for itself, only the remakes for Shadow Dragon and Mystery of the Emblem, one of which never even made it outside of Japan. The series wasn't doing well, only okay at best, and because of that, nails were continually being driven into its coffin. Team Emblem was given one more chance to create the Fire Emblem game they wanted, and in 2012, they released a game that would be the awakening for the potential of the brand across the world.